So, good afternoon, everybody. I'll try it again. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, that's very good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. It's a nice afternoon outside. I hope you can hear me without too many issues on the mic. We'll have the Mr. Expert in the back try and modulate that sound. Thank you very much for choosing to come here. I always say it's a bit like the airlines. I know you've got a choice of activity this afternoon, which usually involves me or sleep or the pool. So I'm very grateful that you have chosen to come to see this third of the formal presentations that I will do for the short period that I'm on the ship. We will do, and please check your program, a Q&A town hall style meeting, which is the only type of presentation that I really get nervous about, I must tell you. And that will come up, I think, tomorrow late afternoon, very early evening. So just check it out, because if there are any issues that you would like discussed, or at least perhaps dissected amongst you, don't ask me for all the answers in this world, I must tell you, on all of these big issues that I raise. But it would be really good to have a discussion with you about some of the areas that I might have omitted, or some of the additional areas that you might think is important as part of this lecture series on important big macro global trends into the future. So if you can, and not too exhausted after the rather nice day tomorrow on the beach, please come out tomorrow evening. Now, the third presentation in this sort of short little lecture series deals with my home continent. A big continent it is, I might tell you, and as you know, I come from the southern tip of the continent, Cape Town in South Africa. But it's interesting for me, traveling around the world, just to see Africa's growth in terms of its economic potential into the future. I've traveled quite a bit in the African continent, or on the African continent, in the course of the last few months, for that matter. And there's no doubt that across the continent there is a feeling of optimism. I've entitled this particular talk, Arise Africa or Demise Africa, because there are those Afro-optimists out there who are looking for the next investment opportunity. And of course, there are those Afro-pessimists out there that will tell me whatever I say is actually pretty much not correct. It's a disaster and going in one direction only. So I'm not quite sure whether I'll convince any of those Afro-pessimists to my more optimistic view on the continent by the end of this talk, but I'll give it a shot. Just again, to give myself a little plug, it's downloadable. I don't sell copies of it, hard copies anymore. From Amazon, my book, Tracking the Future, which I might add does contain a full chapter on Africa into the future. It's a great price on Amazon. I don't know how Amazon do it like that, probably because I get no royalties at all from this kind of price that they charge. But there you go. That's a change in the way we procure our books. Now, I look at Africa, obviously, from a business point of view. A lot of the companies that I consult with are companies that are in search of better returns on their investment. They're looking for new markets in particular. And they are asking themselves the question, do we move out of our home comfort zone countries, like that of the United States or Western Europe or Asia? Do we look at new emerging markets? Do we look at new middle classes that are coming on stream? And do we go into parts of the world that we wouldn't have dreamt of going only 5 or 10 years ago? Parts of the world that we would have barely heard of 5 or 10 years ago. And really, companies increasingly, I mean, they've already looked and they've already expanded into the Asian economic growth story. And you saw yesterday in Ho Chi Minh City, and some of you went on tours of the tunnels, and you went on the Mekong Delta, and you did all the right cultural things. I did also my usual cultural practice, which was to seek out the latest and greatest shopping malls of Ho Chi Minh City. And I went to see a fascinating shopping mall where every single major luxury brand had now established itself in Saigon, as it was known. Those companies like Swarovski and the Gap and Mango certainly have taken the plunge into coming into Vietnam, communist country, lest we forget. Many of these same companies, I will refer to a little bit later, are looking, in addition to their Asian expansion, into expanding into Africa. So we could call this lecture Africa the final investment frontier, now that Asia has largely been conquered. But of course, there are dangers to be had in Africa with an investment of dollars or any other currency on this continent. So I hope that you can at least, although we're far away from Africa, see this lecture as part of the global trend series that I do. I think the continent is going to be an important economic player globally into the future, notwithstanding the many controversies and issues that still plague Africa's growth today. Now, if you had, some of you might read The Economist magazine. I love The Economist magazine. It's a great read. I can never get through that whole magazine every week. I don't know how they produce that every single week. But 10 years ago, this great magazine ran a cover story about Africa. 10 years ago, not a long time ago. And they referred to Africa as the hopeless continent. Hopeless, they called it. 10 years later, they ran another cover story about Africa, and they changed their tune quite substantially from hopeless to rising. And in that rising article, they still apologized, I must tell you, for getting that analysis very, very wrong a decade earlier. So if you had believed The Economist magazine back in 2000, more or less, you as an investor would have probably missed out on a decade of fairly dramatic economic growth. GDP growth certainly coming out of the African continent. This GDP growth continues, I must tell you, to grow, and we'll talk about it in a short while. But again, just to give you an idea of the size of the African continent, here's one of my favorite maps that I like to look at when analyzing Africa. It's a map that simply shows you how big the continent is and how many of the other world's major countries can fit into Africa with ease. And you can just see, I know that it's often difficult to get your head around the size of this continent, especially for those of you that intend to travel in Africa or have traveled in Africa. You can just see, Africa can fit, China can easily fit into Africa, the United States as well, India as well, most of Eastern and Central Europe, the major European countries as well. The UK is about the size of Madagascar, by the way, and Japan is this little slice that can cut through parts of Africa. An enormous continent, each area, region, 54 countries on the continent with their own political setup, their own historical background, their own ethnic issues, their own colonial history. So to talk about Africa in 45 minutes is probably something what one really is more like a sort of mission impossible to really do with any kind of validity at all, but I'll make some generalized remark about the continent itself. Again, globally, one of the most important aspects of any study to me of the future and how change will affect the lives of people is the study of demographics. And I just want to show you this map because I didn't show it to you earlier. And it really reflects, well, it reflects quite interestingly a number of changes across the world, not just in Africa. But this is a map, of course, that is skewed to represent where people live. Where are the great population centers of this world? So here we have the snapshot in front of you of the world in 1960. And in 1960, you can see that the population of Europe, both Western Europe and Central Europe, relatively healthy in terms of numbers of people, quite large population centers in Europe. You can see always large populations in India, large populations in China. You can just see the countries distorted to represent where people live. Japan, of course, always a very populous country given its relatively small land mass. What's interesting about this particular map is that Europe is populous, but Africa much less so. In fact, Africa in this map looks relatively scrawny by comparison to the big population centers of this world. Now, the latest population figures that have been done, and I tell you, demographers are updating this population story for the future all the time, and I'll give you some of the latest information that only came out over the course of the last week or two. But if we project the world's population from 1960 to 2050, so let's move to my magical year of 2050, and I all fondly believe we're all going to be going around. You'll still be cruising, I must tell you, by 2050. Let's project. Watch carefully on the map. You can just see the shift in population growth across this world. I'll go back quickly to 1960. Watch Europe's population decline and watch Africa's population bulge. You can just see the bulge in India continues more or less unabated. The Chinese bulge has got slightly smaller over the course of the next 40, 50 years as populations elsewhere in the world start to swell. So in relation to this dramatic growth of population in Africa, so you are seeing a modicum of a decline coming through in China, also as a result of their one-child policy. But the big story from that map is the swelling populations of Africa, particularly in West Africa and in East Africa, reaching all the way down to Southern Africa. Just look at that swelling population there. That's the North Africa, Egypt, a little bit there. I mean, that's where the big population centers are going to be by 2050. And I think it gives you an indication, visually at least, of the changes that are coming in this world. And you can just see the United States, sorry, just to go beyond Africa for a second, the US population still looking very similar in terms of the rest of the world, shrinking slightly because of this big growth of populations in the developing world and in Asia. So the US population relatively sort of, I mean, reasonably static. South America as well. What's interesting here, just because we've been talking about Russia and the Crimea over the course of the last while, big news, that's the depiction of Russia's population by 2050, rapidly declining, I might add. And for the Australians in the audience, that's how Australia is depicted by 2050. So you can see who's going to have the populations and where the pressures will be into the future. On the African continent, 60,000 new babies are born every single day. 60,000 born every single day. This is indeed the part of the world in which the biggest population growth is going to occur in the next 50 to 100 years. In only 4 decades, a quarter of the world's population, a quarter, will live in the African continent, and over 50% of that population will be under the age of 20. So if you're analyzing Africa, well, you can either say that's great. There's a young population, a working age population that's going to be big, young people able to do work in future, or for that matter, young people who will not have work in future. And of course, with that could come social instability. Again, you can look at the glass half full, as I always say, or you can look at the glass half empty. But in terms of attracting business into the African continent, this increase in young, relatively able-bodied people across the continent is, in fact, in my book at least, something that I'd rather like to see as a positive going forward, as long as governance in these African countries, as long as the social indicators, as long as poverty levels, as long as educational levels and opportunities continue to advance as well as the population. So there's a big but there, I suppose. But the data available to us now does show that there are improvements. Just very quickly, these are the latest population figures coming from those who study Africa. And I can tell you, for all of the figures that I've given you, the new studies show that population growth in these countries that are shaded deep red on the chart are growing at even more dramatic pace than I have indicated. So, and I think there is some element of concern here about population growth. It's all very well when populations grow in countries with strong economies, but we're going to see very substantial population growth in Congo, a country that's in deep difficulty at the moment. Mali, Niger, Chad, all of these countries showing the most population growth, all of them in a degree of political instability. Somalia as well. So, you know, the extreme population growth centers on the African continent are coming in some troublesome parts of Africa. Just quickly, this population growth, and I'll come back to it again in the talk, is going to specifically be felt in Africa's cities. And a city like Lagos, for example, by 2050 is going to have a population of 40 million people. 40 million people in Lagos alone. That's up from about 10 million people currently. These are massive figures. Big cities like Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Luanda, all growing and growing dramatically over the course of the next while. And if you want a dramatic figure for the future, the United Nations have very recently come out with their projections for which countries of the world will have the biggest populations by 2100. And India's population is expected, therefore, by 2100 to reach 1.5 billion people. China will drop to second because of the one-child policy and an aging China by 2100. But this, look at that figure for Nigeria, the third biggest population center in the world at 900 million people by 2100. This is indeed a frightening statistic given instability in Nigeria currently But look, if Nigeria does manage to pull itself out of the difficulties that it's in, this makes this country a crucial country in future for business, for the sale of goods and services and products, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. The United States remains quite a healthy fourth in terms of its population growth, growing at relatively favorable levels to encourage, to enable the country to have a pool of younger people to do the work. And the US does get that figure largely from immigrant communities, I might add. And just look at the rest of the top 10. Indonesia, 300 million people, and then the African countries, Tanzania, Congo, Ethiopia, and Uganda, rounding off the top 10. The top 10 of the top 10's most populous nations in the world by 2100. You can see that I think 6 out of the top 10 are indeed African nations. Tremendous pressure. So, one could assume, therefore, that given this population explosion across the continent, Africa, in fact, should, just because of its population, just because of an increasing demand for goods and services, register economic growth. If it doesn't register economic growth over the course of the next 50 or 60 years, it would be the first region of the world which did not experience economic growth corresponding to its population growth. We've seen that in Asia, clearly. You've seen it on this particular cruise. Africa clearly behind Asia, but nevertheless, now is the time for Africa to start growing. So, within the global context, I must tell you, Africa doesn't look that bad. When you go back and you look at some of the downturn, particularly in Europe over the course of the last while, some African countries now look, if you look at the statistics from these countries, some African countries actually look relatively healthy. Their balance sheet doesn't look too bad. In case you think these countries' balance sheets are all a disaster, let me show you otherwise. What was quite interesting in relation to this particular point is that at the start of the global financial crisis, really following Greece and then the domino effect to Spain, to Portugal, to Ireland, Africa started to look at what was happening. Back in 2010, when the global economic crisis began, the Spanish finance minister said, well, this won't happen to Spain. Spain is not Greece, said the Spanish finance minister. The Economist magazine said Portugal is not Greece. In other words, this won't happen to Portugal, happened to Greece, but it won't happen to Portugal. Man, that crisis happened to Spain and to Portugal. The Greek finance minister said Greece is not Ireland. Well, indeed, the troubles hit Ireland, and of course the troubles got worse in Greece. The Spanish finance minister said Spain is neither Ireland nor Portugal. Of course, Spain got into trouble along with Ireland and Portugal. The Irish finance minister said Ireland is not in Greek territory, said the Irish finance minister. The Secretary General of the OECD countries said neither Spain nor Portugal is Ireland. The head of the rating agencies, Fitch, said Italy is not Spain. Well, of course, Italy fell into some degree of economic malaise as a result of the crisis. The Spanish Prime Minister said Spain is not Uganda, because the Spanish Prime Minister at the time thought that Uganda was such a basket case that Spain could never be as poorly off as Uganda was as a country. And the Ugandan Foreign Minister in 2012 said Uganda does not want to be Spain, because the Ugandan foreign minister, whatever we may say about Uganda, had looked at some of the basic statistics of his country's economy. And if you compare the landlocked country of Uganda in the center of Africa with Spain back in 2011, you will see some interesting points of comparison. Uganda had oil reserves in the billion barrels of oil, compared 1 billion barrels of oil, not too bad. Uganda had GDP growth of 6.4% compared to Spain's barely 1% of growth. Uganda's debt was measured in the billions, but in Spain, their debt was measured in the trillions. And of course, their debt to GDP, well, in Spain, 70% plus, in Uganda, 25% or so. It's no wonder, therefore, that the Ugandans didn't want to be compared to the Spanish. When you look at some of the sets of data coming out of Africa, well, the comparison between some of these countries that you might regard yourself here as being basket cases in Africa actually compare, well, relatively favorably, I suppose, to some of the European countries. Now, having said that, let me contradict myself immediately. Those who study Africa and study all of the figures that come out of African countries, we must take some of the figures, some of that economic data with a slight pinch of salt. There's a very interesting study has been done on all of these figures and statistics that come out, in particular of African countries, and I can tell you there's very poor reporting and very unreliable reporting of so many of the core economic figures to come out of these countries. So I will present you with a variety of figures today that I hope come from reputable sources, but I think we just have to keep in the back of our mind that some of these figures may well be somewhat suspect if we drill down deeply into them. These, of course, were the figures that were presented at Davos at the World Economic Forum only a few months ago. And these are the figures that show where the world is at right now and where the world will be by 2015. And just to quickly remind you that whilst China is growing at 7.5% for this year, Sub-Saharan Africa will grow at 6.1%. 6.1% for most of Africa below, south of the Sahara. That's a remarkable growth rate, I must tell you. In fact, that Sub-Saharan African growth rate of 6.1% makes it about the world's fastest growing continent in terms of average GDP. And on this particular chart, you can just see the green bar at the bottom of the screen indicates that if we had to compare Africa's growth with Asia's growth overall, they're pretty close, I must tell you. But Africa may well edge out Asia in terms of economic growth over the course of this year. Again, I just remind you that Africa starts from a much lower base than Asia, and therefore some of these fancy growth rates are just that, fancy growth rates. But statistically, you can see the growth starting to come through in these countries' performance. 7 in every 10 people in the region now live in countries that have averaged economic growth rates in excess of 4% for the past decade. And those growth rates haven't dropped below 4%, as has been the case in much of Europe, even in the United States for that matter. In the last number of years, in the mid-2000s, Ethiopia, for example, recorded a growth rate better than China. Whilst Uganda, again, as a country, outperformed India's growth rate. So you just see some of these figures coming through from the continent that do point to a more optimistic future, perhaps Africa then being a little richer, generally speaking, than what one would think. There's a certain accumulation of wealth taking place across the continent. Most African economies more or less have shown pretty good growth in the last decade. It's a young continent, a new middle class that I'll come to in a moment. And of course, as populations and growth has surged in Asia, and as we've seen this commodity super cycle take effect in the last decade, Africa, with its commodity richness, has become a core component of the global growth cycle and a core component of the demand for commodities coming from this part of the world for that matter. So commodities have locked Africa into the global economic sphere, I suppose, like never before. Which countries are going to do well? Over the course of over the course of 2013, who've been the winners and losers? Again, I won't go through all of the countries on the chart, just to indicate to you that a country like Libya, which we would obviously regard as an African country, coming off an incredibly low base, showing great growth, but again, off a low base from a point of view where the country barely, of course, came to a standstill. So maybe we should discount Libya's 12% growth rate. But countries that, you barely would have given the light of day in terms of being future economic success stories, Sierra Leone, the Ivory Coast, even Congo with its difficult political setup, Ghana at about 8%, although Ghana's growth will be off. All of these countries showing quite impressive, more than quite impressive growth rates. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see those countries with less impressive growth rates, I must add. Some of them quite disappointing, and I can only add my one here, South Africa down at just under 3% growth. But as some would say, if I might just say, we at least have reliable statistics on our economy. We can't always be sure whether the statistics are as reliable for some of these other great growth stories. So our growth story might actually be the more reliable one when compared to some of the others. Now, the rest of the world are looking at Africa like never before. There's more direct investment, foreign direct investment into the continent. And the trend line, with the exception of last year, I must tell you the trend line has been positive. There's investment coming in, yes, from Asia, and I'll mention that in a moment, but there continues to be great investment coming into the continent from the European Union, from France, who have always had historical linkages into the African continent, and of course also from the United States and from Great Britain, who continue to invest quite heavily in Africa. From a social perspective on the continent, there has been an improvement in the living conditions of Africans. And this is an important issue because for all of the fancy economic data that I can show you, the question really is, are people themselves deriving benefit? Are they better off today? Are people still living in poverty? Yes, they are. But child mortality figures are down. The chart, as you can see, without going into too much detail, the chart shows the countries which have made the most progress in alleviating child mortality, which includes countries like Senegal and Rwanda and Kenya. And there's a concerted effort across the continent to, in fact, address this kind of issue. And again, look at the data coming from the continent. And I'm amazed by it because I have to use most of the most reputable research that I could find when looking at this. Poverty rates across the continent have dropped, as the trend line on the graph shows. And again, for the next year, it looks as though we're going to see an even further drop in poverty rates. So suddenly, African economies are looking attractive places in which to invest. That's the new skyline of a city called Luanda, which is the capital of Angola. This is a country that now has an economy worth about $100 billion per annum. It's an oil-rich economy, I must tell you. And that's why Angola, of course, has become extremely important. The yachts are indicative of a new elite. It looks a little bit like the south of France, I suppose. Not quite the south of France yet, just for those of you who are thinking of renting a yacht down in Luanda. But nevertheless, there is a sign that that economy is turning. A more pleasurable visit of mine last year was to the island of Mauritius. Tiny little speck of space in the Indian Ocean, I must tell you, but an island that has positioned itself as an entry point into African investment opportunities, an island with a good tax regime. And this little island really is promoting itself as the conduit into Africa. There's the Bank of Mauritius, by the way. You're going to see some of the new gleaming types of building and architecture that this little island now has. Again, an important entry point for many considering investing in Africa, particularly if you're coming from India and looking at investment, or from Asia. Mauritius being geographically close to you is an important, as I say, conduit into the continent. African countries don't have great debt, partially because their own citizens don't demand that much from their governments. Not like in Western Europe or the United States, of course, where governments provide benefits, social benefits. It's simply not the case across the African continent. So debt to GDP as an important economic indicator, well under control in Africa. On the map, if your country is shaded in green, you have very manageable debt to GDP. In other words, your government doesn't owe much, and the people don't demand much. The people may well demand in future, especially as they rise and become, have greater expectations into the future. You can just see on that map which of the countries of this world have got heavy debt to GDP ratios. Those shaded in dark brown or purple or brown, as you can see on the map, the United States in particular, Western Europe in particular, one or two other countries dotted around the world where debt is creeping up. So I think Africa's got some way to go. It's not a problem. Debt is not a problem for African countries anymore. It was as a result of aid that came into these countries after the end of colonialization. Today, it's not really an issue. It's creeping up, but not an issue for the moment. Most of these African countries, well, 2/3, I suppose, of African countries today actually do hold free elections. Free elections. I'm not quite sure how fair many of these elections are, and many of these countries still have great disputes about whether or not these elections take place in ideal circumstances. But statistically, again, we can show that there is a much greater degree of accountability across the continent, more countries allowing a free vote, and more governments changing hands at the ballot box than ever before. This trend towards urbanization across the continent is very, very dramatic. I showed you the scene before. All I want to indicate to you is that for those of you who think that the more people who live like this are a disaster waiting to happen, the economic charts show that the more people urbanize, the more they urbanize, which is the green bars here, the better off they generally are in terms of their GDP per head. So again, we can show and we can statistically show that people who move into cities, generally speaking, do better. And that's why they move into cities. That's why they leave rural parts of the country in the hope of doing better, and many of them actually do. But of course, if you're going to leave your rural roots, well, you also leave behind the agrarian nature of your history. You leave behind the farming communities, the critical food supplying communities in any of these countries, and you add to that urban sprawl that encroaches upon arable land, and that's one of the challenges of Africa's cities. We also look increasingly at Africa for signs of an emerging middle class. Is there a middle class across the African continent? And in very limited terms, there is a middle class. Middle class, everyone has a different definition of middle class, I must tell you. And if we had two economists here to analyze this, we would be busy for the rest of the night on the issue of what constitutes a middle class African. Well, I can just show you how low the bar is on the African continent. But if you earn about $2 a day, anywhere between $2 a day and $20 a day, most economic think tanks will regard you as being a middle-class citizen in African terms if you earn between $2 a day and $20 a day. So the middle class in Africa is growing, and on the basis of those very limited figures, there are about 300 million Africans now across the continent, just over 1 billion people on the continent, but nearly 1/3 would be classed as being of some sort or other a middle-class citizen. And if you are a middle-class citizen, you have enough income to choose how to spend that income. It might not all go for basic foods and survival material. It could also go to buying goods and services and even small luxuries that you could never afford before. So there are new consumers emerging across the African continent, particularly in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Egypt, in Angola, Kenya, and selected parts of Africa that are now encouraging so many big brands to come onto the continent. Walmart, for those of you in the United States, you will be aware that Walmart is desperately looking to grow its share of global business. And you know, if you're an investor in Walmart, that Walmart, they're having trouble in ticking up those sales, those revenues, those turnovers in their US domestic stores. They're looking at this new moderate level of middle class people in Africa as a potential to boost profits. And Walmart have come in to my country in South Africa in a very big way, I must tell you, in the last year or two. And no doubt they will be testing out their African experience into the future with their South African exposure. Companies like Gap and Zara will shortly not only be in my country, they will also look for opportunities in other parts of Africa. This middle class story is the interesting one. And you know, what defines a middle class person? Well, very often it's whether they can afford to buy a vehicle. And in some parts of Africa, vehicle ownership has increased substantially. In a country like Ghana on the west coast of Africa, tremendous vehicle purchasing power by a portion of their community. This is the Porsche, talking about portions, this is the Porsche showroom in Lagos in Nigeria. Now they tell me that this is one of the most profitable new Porsche outlets across the world in Lagos in Nigeria. But frankly, if you purchase that vehicle, I don't know whether you are able to drive your Porsche properly on those terribly clogged and pretty grim roads that are characteristic of Nigeria. I don't know what you do with your Porsche in Lagos. I must tell you, clearly it's not a problem that I have, my friends. Across the African continent, though, the skies are opening up. For those involved in the airline industry here, and I know there are quite a few, these African airlines suddenly acquiring new aircraft. Ethiopian Airlines, the first airline in Africa to use the new Boeing 787 jetliner, expanding their routes. And you know, it used to be difficult to get to Africa. This airline, Emirates and Etihad and Qatar Airways from the Gulf, the three big Gulf carriers now servicing cities in Africa that you would never have ever thought of would generate enough traffic for major and regular airline offerings. So a substantial change as well. And we are on the cusp, I might add, of also seeing something of an oil boom coming out of this continent. More oil, natural gases than ever before are currently being explored and exploited. And of course, that has its own set of possible advantages, making Africa a oil powerhouse. But also, the key question always to be raised is who derives benefit from these great commodity finds? Does the benefits filter down to the people, or does it get kept by an elite group of people who simply provide their cronies and their families access to all the profits? Of course, we have to raise that question in dealing with Africa. The continent itself is now being covered by mobile phone penetration like never before. There are 650 million mobile phone subscribers across the African continent in all shapes and sizes. As you can see, it's marvelous to travel across Africa. Everybody has a mobile phone, and that's how they access the internet, by the way. They don't have fixed lines or DSL or WiMAX or Wi-Fi offerings. They do it via their internet service providers. And for the first time, in parts of Africa, we see young Africans getting together to create applications in what we call innovation hubs, particularly in a city like Nairobi. It's quite exciting to see this development across the continent. I showed you this picture before, of course, of people. This happens to be in the Chinese city of Qingdao, up in the north of China. And I show you that picture again because Africa's future growth, and I think already its current growth, it's not just because there's a new middle class. It's not just because African poverty levels have been improved. It's not just because more Africans have access to educational opportunities and health and good medicine that they do get as a result of being urbanized. But Africa's growth has occurred at the same time as these great economies of Asia have come on stream. And these people demand commodities. Where are they going to get their commodities from? Their food, their water, their timber, their iron ore, their metals. They're going to get their commodities from the African continent. And this growth that we've seen in Asia has occurred commensurately with Africa's growth story as well. Africa today represents about 60% of the available cropland left in the world. So, if you're looking at feeding 1 billion Chinese and 1 billion Indians and millions of other people across this world, you will potentially look at investing in land and in agribusiness on the African continent. And already, huge tracts of land on the African continent have been acquired by not only the Chinese, but by the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Turks and those in the European Union and elsewhere for agribusiness generation of goods and services that get exported out of Africa to, of course, other countries of the world. The biggest, I suppose, talking point in Africa when you travel through Africa right now is what is the influence of China on Africa. And we could do a week-long seminar on whether China is good or bad for the African continent. China's growth with Africa has been astounding. Again, the graph, just look at the red line. The red line indicates China's growth as a trading partner with Africa. And you can just see that only in the last 20-odd years, China has gone from nowhere to becoming Africa's biggest trading partner, today overtaking the United States. So you can see who gets pride of place, I suppose, when it comes to trade options in Africa. It's certainly the Chinese, and the Chinese have been very deft and I think very efficient at not only combining trade, but politically pushing themselves really into a position of ascendancy across the African continent. In the last decade, trade deals between China and Africa have been substantial. This has created a degree of excitement in parts of Africa where the Chinese come in and they build infrastructure, which does last and enables Africans to derive medium to long-term benefit. But there's an increasing controversy, of course, about some of these deals between African governments and the Chinese. The Chinese sometimes bring in their own workers. They don't employ local Africans. They bring in their own architects, quantity surveyors. They don't employ local Africans. And many of the deals have been to the advantage, perhaps more of the Chinese, than it has been to the local African countries themselves. The deals themselves quite controversial. And in a sense, the Chinese might have had the best of these deals in the last decade. I think there's going to be a pullback. There's more skepticism coming from African heads of state right now. Just quickly, this is a very interesting map. I always like showing this one. This is a map of the world which shows which countries of the world are most exposed to Chinese growth. If you shade it in deep red, You are reliant upon Chinese growth into the future, at least to some degree, to keep your economy going. And again, you can see where's the deep red countries of this world, much of Africa, heavily reliant upon China. And I must just tell you, for my friends in Australia, you are also heavily reliant upon China. And you know that your mineral story is directly related into the Chinese economic expansion. So, it's been pretty good news about Africa. Africa's got oil reserves, 12% of all global oil reserves. It's got 40% of gold, 80% of chromium, platinum, a mineral-rich country. But, for all of this great natural commodities, Africa only provides 1% of all global manufacturing. 1%. All of Africa, for the moment at least, often is exported out of Africa, the natural and precious commodities. And the continent has to encourage domestic manufacturing, much like you've seen here in Vietnam and you've seen in other parts of Southeast Asia in particular. Domestic manufacturing is what's really kick-started these economies, from South Korea even to Vietnam. Vietnam behind South Korea by 30, 40 years. But you see that changes on the streets of Saigon. We haven't got on the African continent yet a domestic manufacturing sector that can really kickstart the economy quite adequately. So, with those sort of very bullish words about Africa, a very quick reality check, just to bring me back into focus. Africa has its problems. That is the aftermath of the Westgate shopping mall terror attack in Kenya last year, when when terrorists effectively killed 50, 60 people in that shopping mall. I was, in fact, in Nairobi that weekend, very fortunately not anywhere near that mall. But, it hits home. And terrorism and tyrants as well, like Mr. Mugabe, who heads up Zimbabwe. Africa continues, of course, to be a place where tyrants operate often with impunity and where terrorists increasingly do operate in parts of the continent. Infrastructure across the continent remains pretty poor, I must tell you. Huge amounts need to be spent in order to make the continent competitive. And for all the fancy talk I can give you about a middle class, 250 million Africans still go hungry every single day. So there are huge income disparities, wealth disparities that exist on the African continent. There is an issue about wealth and income inequality and disparity that affects all of us in all of our countries, by the way, but it's particularly acute on the African continent. And as a result of poor governance in the last 30, 40 years or so, many talented Africans, as you know, have left Africa. They're now residing in Europe, in Asia, or in the United States. Locking them back into Africa is indeed difficult. Although with these growth rates now, very often African countries are starting to seem more attractive now for those expats who've left the continent. So there is a little bit of an about turn. There's been some negative press coming out of a country like Uganda. I started this talk with something about Uganda. The issue regarding gay rights in Uganda, as you might know, legislation in that country in the last few months now, in fact, criminalize homosexual activity in Uganda. And again, negative publicity for that country. Of course, European countries will impose some sort of trade sanctions against Uganda for that. And in Nigeria, for all the great talk about nearly 1 billion people, great new market, my retail clients all want to go into Nigeria, because when you've got 1 billion people coming up in the next 80 years, those are the people who are going to buy jeans and T-shirts and sneakers and banking and insurance products. It's going to come from Nigeria. But this is the former governor of the Nigerian Reserve Bank who just uncovered a missing $20 billion, from an oil deal that seems to have gone sour. And he was duly suspended and then fired as the head of the Reserve Bank of Nigeria. These issues of corruption and graft continue to plague Africa. So I hope at least I've tried to give you a vaguely balanced picture in 45 minutes or so of the African continent. I think there's great potential on this continent, more so than ever before. And I think for the first time, at least, when we look at Africa, even if you're all still pessimists about this continent, we don't just judge Africa anymore for being vulnerable. We do judge the continent now for the possibilities that it presents all of us. And I know that my clients certainly, when looking at Africa, are looking for the possibilities. They are prepared to withstand in many instances, the corruption, the graft, the red tape, the bureaucracy, the inefficiencies, the power shortages that occur, the greasing the palms with silver, as is often the case, they are prepared well to withstand that in, of course, the pursuit of profit and the pursuit of expanding their business bottom line. And I think, if anything, I'd like to just raise awareness about my home continent in this particular talk and just point out to you that you've been in Asia now. You've seen a great growth story coming out of this continent. You'll see it again, of course, in Singapore and in Bangkok as well, notwithstanding the difficulties in Thailand. There's another continent in this world that's starting to rear its head, and possibly, indeed, Africa will be the final frontier. Thanks very much for listening to me.